Okay, in this video we're going to actually construct and analyze our next model. This is called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. I refer to it as the ADAS model. And this is going to be very similar to the supply and demand model, the market model we looked at in an earlier lesson when we were kind of taking a microeconomic approach, thinking about what determines the price and the number of a good or service that's sold in a particular market. And so we're going to take basically that same skeleton, that same structure, and we're going to use it now to track things at the macro level. So rather than thinking about the quantity of a particular good or service, we're going to be trying to think about what's happening with total output of all goods and services. And so likewise, instead of the price of that particular good or service, we want to think about what's happening to the overall price level as we discussed in a previous lesson. So we're going to look at the two sides of the model, and then we're going to put them together and see, well, what does this model tell us about the economy when something changes? So the first side of the model is the demand side. And the basic definition of demand is simply the level of output demanded at various price levels. So it's almost identical to our definition of demand for a particular good or service. We're just going to keep it real simple. And so what we want to keep in mind is that when we talk about demand, we're also essentially talking about the expenditures, so those aggregate expenditures that we discussed in a previous lesson. And so that means consumption, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So this is, we're trying to track the level of goods and services that households, firms, governments, and foreigners are going to be demanding at different price levels. And we're not going to go into, for now, the theory behind why we observe the inverse relationship that we do. But generally speaking, it makes sense that when the cost of living, when the price level is higher, that households, firms, governments, foreigners are not going to be willing to purchase. They're not going to demand as much in goods and services. And alternatively, when the price is very low, then the demand will be higher for overall output. So that's our basic definition of demand. And just like at the micro level, we observe that there is an inverse relationship between the price level and level of output. And so if you look at the handout I posted, the very first graph just shows you a basic aggregate demand curve. So we see this inverse relationship between price level and output. And we denote output with a capital Y, which we also use to denote total income. So remember, with GDP, total output, we can measure it by expenditures, total expenditures, or total income. So you'll see me or hear me using those terms interchangeably: output, income, GDP, and then we'll just abbreviate it with capital Y. So that's our basic aggregate demand curve. And then what we might ask is, well, we know that the level of output demanded will rise or fall as price level rises or falls, but what might actually cause the entire demand curve itself to shift, to either increase or decrease? And it's real simple, because we've already talked about these four determinants, these four components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And so if we see any of those forms of expenditures increase, right? If households try to go out and spend more money, or if firms try to go out and engage in more investment spending, right? So if any of those increase, we would see an increase in aggregate demand. We would see all of these groups demanding more output, whatever the current price level is. And conversely, if we see a decrease in any one of those four components, so if maybe government cuts its spending, or maybe if foreigners are demanding less American goods and services, so our exports go down, our net exports go down, then we would see a decrease in the aggregate demand curve. So we'd see less output demanded regardless of the price level. And so again, if you look at the handout, if you scroll down, let's see, to the very last page, we've got those two changes in aggregate demand sketched out. So just a general increase in demand and a general decrease in demand. And what we see, we'll come back to that actually later when we actually put the two sides of the market together. But if you just focus on the demand side for now, ignore that aggregate supply curve, you see that we've just got a general increase or decrease, shift to the left or shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. Now, to switch to the other side of the economy. So remember, with our Keynesian, our aggregate expenditures model, we were really only focused on the spending, the expenditures, the demand side of the economy. But now what we're going to do is we're going to add in supply side analysis. So we're going to look at aggregate supply. And a basic definition of aggregate supply is simply the level of output that firms will collectively supply at various price levels. All right, so very similar to our definition of aggregate demand, but now we're looking at the other side of the economy. And generally speaking, when the price level is higher, right, when the prices of goods and services are higher, we would expect to see greater output supplied, so a positive relationship. More firms will be willing to accept higher prices. And then at very low prices, right, when the price falls, we'd see the output that firms supply fall. So we've got a positive relationship in general. Now, on the supply side, it gets a little bit trickier when we try to actually graph this relationship. And so, again, if you look down to the handout that I posted, if you look at so we're back up on the first page where we've got aggregate supply defined, and then I've got two curves side by side. And so these both represent forms of what we call the short-run aggregate supply curve. And the reason is this, is because when we think about supply, we want to think about how output supply is going to change with respect to both the time frame, right, whether we're looking at a short run period of time or a long run, right, so maybe a few weeks to months up to many, many years or decades, right, and everything in between. But we also may want to think about supply in terms of the current level of output, okay? So if you look at that graph on the left that's labeled very short run, we see that it's basically flat. And what this tells us is that if firms want to start producing more, right, more output in the very short run, they're going to be able to do that, but we aren't really going to see any increase in prices. Now, a couple different reasons for this. With respect to the time frame, there are two things that are going to kind of keep prices locked in. In a sense, they become sticky, like Keynes observed. We'll come back to that in a second, though. But basically, what we observe are things like menu cost and contracts. And a menu cost is simply the cost of communicating your prices, right? Posting your prices. That's what a menu is, right? You walk into a restaurant, they hand you a menu, and it has a list of all of the items they serve, and then a price of every item. Okay. Well, it costs money to print that menu up, right? If you sell stuff online, it costs money to run the website and to update it. Okay, so if something happens and a firm, just recognize that okay, our costs are going up. Well, we would certainly like to, raise our prices to cover our costs. But in addition to try and cover those costs of maybe our land, labor, and capital, we'd incur more costs to print new menus, right? To post new prices. And so what we see for a period of time is that, or a very short period of time, very short run, is that even though firms' costs may be going up, its menu prices, right, the prices that it communicates to consumers are going to stay constant until the firm judges that it's definitely worth it now to go ahead and spend the money to produce new menus, to post new prices, so we can cover our costs. All right. So for a very short run, we're talking weeks, months, firms will just keep selling at the same price because they don't want to spend money posting new prices. Now, in addition to that, in the short run, the very short run, we have contracts that lock prices in. So let's again say that you're a firm, you're a restaurant, and you buy lots of fruits and vegetables from farmers. Okay, well there are prices that you pay to those farmers, and you may sign a contract saying that okay, I agree to buy my lettuce and tomato from you, and you're going to agree to only sell it to me at a fixed price for some period of time, right? So we agree to that, we sign the contract, and then no matter what's going on, that farmer will always sell me the lettuce and tomato for the same price. Well, if the farmer's costs go up, right, it costs them more to grow their crops, well, they would certainly like to charge me more, right, which would then maybe cause me to charge more to my customers. But as long as I've got that contract in place, I don't have to pay higher prices to the farmer, right, simply because their costs go up. And so for a period of time, I will still be purchasing my lettuce and tomato for the same price, which means that's not going to change the cost of my cheeseburger or my salad that I'm making for my restaurant. So menu cost and contracts are two things that lock prices in for a short period of time, weeks, months, maybe even up to a year. It just kind of depends. Now, eventually, what we're going to see is that firms will start to post new prices, right? They will decide that it's worth it to incur the cost of posting new prices, of printing new menus. And with contracts, well, contracts don't necessarily last forever, and so as contracts expire, they have to be renegotiated. So at some point, the farmer says, okay, it's time for a new contract. I've got to charge you more for the lettuce and the tomato. And I say, okay, so we sign a new contract, and then we're locked into that price. But now my costs have gone up, and so I may deem it, worth it to go ahead and reprint my menus to reflect that I have to pay more for the lettuce and tomatoes, so the cheeseburger and the salad are also going to cost more now. And so what we see is that prices become unstuck in a sense. And so now we shift to that second short run curve, short run aggregate supply curve, and we see that as output continues to increase, as time goes by, right? So we're not in the very short run, but we're still in a relative short run. We see prices start to become more flexible, but we also are going to see that firms are going to start competing more for resources, because obviously if you're going to produce more output, you need more resources. Well, when there's more firms trying to get their hands on more land, labor, and capital, that's going to cause resource prices to go up, which means firms' costs go up. And so the only way that they're going to be willing and able to supply more output to produce more goods and services is if they can supply them at a higher price. And so this gets back into that idea of the level of output, right? So we mentioned that at very low levels of output, as we saw in the Great Depression with Keynes's analysis, prices fall, wages fall, they become sticky. And so you can start to produce more, you can start to grow your economy a little bit, but because of all the slack in the economy, there will be really little to no risk of inflation, right? Prices aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon. But as we start to dig ourselves out of the recession, as we start to take up the slack, as resources, right, become less and less available, as menu costs, right, are going to be incurred to post new menu prices, as contracts are renegotiated, all of this is going to start to lead to upward pressure on prices with respect to supply. And so what we see over time is, as we move to higher levels of output, as we go further into time, we'll start to see prices creep up. Now, what happens in the long run? Okay, what happens when we are totally out of recession, when we're looking far into the future, when we know that we'll always be able to post new menu prices, we'll always be able to negotiate contracts? What happens when we reach full employment, right? When we were using all available land, labor, and capital? Well, at this point, we've got to think back to our PPF model. And so recall the PPF model showed us, the maximum amount of, or the largest combinations possible of capital and consumer goods if we used all available resources. And assuming that we don't experience an improvement in technology, assuming we don't increase the quantity or quality of our resources, that PPF was going to be fixed, right? And so you use up all your resources and you get to that frontier, and then you're stuck. You're producing as much as you possibly can. And so what we're going to see on the supply side of the economy then is, if you go down to the next page of graphs, you're going to see that we will reach our long-run aggregate supply. And what's happening at this point is we're essentially reaching the full employment level of output. And when we are able to meet again and go over the dynamics of this model, we're going to see exactly how we can use the short-run aggregate supply curve and the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve, to create this long-run aggregate supply. So stay tuned for that. But for now, we just need to recognize that the long-run aggregate supply curve is fixed at that full employment level of output. That's the most we can possibly do. And that all that's going to change is prices, right? So we can't produce any more than that. And if we try, we'll see later that it's just going to result in a complete flexibility of prices. So we'll just get inflation. Right now, for our purposes to use this model without having to think about very short run, long run curves, right? Rather than having to work with all these different graphs, we're going to try and combine this into one simple aggregate supply curve. And so that's that final graph I've got there. And it's that curved aggregate supply curve. So you see that at relatively low levels of output, the aggregate supply curve is kind of flat, right? We might have a little bit more slack, and so there's little to no risk of prices going up as we increase output. But as we start to produce more and more, we're going to see prices start to rise, contracts renegotiated, new menu prices posted, but also we're going to be taking up the slack, so there's more competition for resources, and we're going to see that the more and more we produce, the higher and higher resource prices get, which means the higher and higher the price level rises. So that's our aggregate supply curve. All right, and then we want to ask real quick before we move on is, what are the determinants of aggregate supply? And lucky for us, the determinants of aggregate supply are basically the same as they were for the supply of a particular good or service at that micro level. And so you recall from one of the earlier lessons that the determinants of supply were things like resource prices, technology, the expectations of suppliers, of firms. What am I missing? Taxes and regulation. And then finally, at the micro level, in a particular market, we would pay attention to the number of sellers, right? Are there many sellers or just a few? And when we switch gears and look at the macro level, what we're gonna describe is what we call market power. And so what this refers to is when we look at various industries and we see, one or a small handful of firms in an industry controlling more and more of the market. All right. So we may have a lot of industries, a lot of markets, and a lot of them may be very competitive, where there's lots and lots of firms competing against each other. But as we start to see concentration within this market and that market and another, what we're saying is that we're seeing an increase in the overall level of market power that's exercised by one or small number of firms. So if we think about what the aggregate supply curve looks like, and we think about what happens if any of those determinants change, well, again, if you scroll back down to the bottom of the handout, we've got two examples here of changes in aggregate supply. So the first one shows an increase in aggregate supply, so it shifts to the right, and the second graph shows a decrease, a shift to the left. So things that might cause aggregate supply to go up, that could be an improvement in technology, maybe we decrease taxes and regulations, or resource prices go down, right? Any of those would cause aggregate supply to go up. And then if any of the opposite happened, so if resource prices went back up, if we lost some technology, if we increased taxes, regulations, if market power increased, we would see aggregate supply decrease. All right. So we've got our demand side of the economy. We've got the inverse relationship between output and price level. We've got the supply side of the economy. In general, a positive relationship. And then what we want to finally do is put the two sides of the market together. And so it looks like on page 2 of the handout, I've got the full model. And so all we do is we combine aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And just like at the micro level, we see that, well, these two curves intersect. And so what we say is happening at the intersection of these two curves is general equilibrium. All right, we have some price level. I've got it denoted as P star. And what's happening at that unique price level is that the level of output that is demanded by all the households, firms, governments, and foreigners is equivalent to the amount of output that all of the firms and businesses are willing to produce and sell. All right, so we're producing just as much as people are wanting to buy at that price level. Okay. Now the last thing to do at this point is to think about, well, what happens? What is our model going to predict will happen to the economy given changes on either the demand or the supply side? And so that's where we go back down to those graphs on the third page of the handout. We've got 4 simple scenarios plotted out here. We've got an increase in demand and a decrease in demand, and then we've also got an increase in aggregate supply and a decrease in aggregate supply. So in any one of these scenarios, right, given some change in the economy that's going to affect either demand or supply, either increase or decrease it, this model now allows us to make predictions just like the market model did for a particular good or service. So for example, let's say that household wealth increases. Okay. Well, we remember that household wealth is a determinant of household consumption. With more wealth, households can consume more, and an increase in household consumption, as we discussed a while ago, is going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And so in that top left graph there, we show aggregate demand increasing. And so what that's going to result in is the demand curve shifting to the right, and we're going to reach a new equilibrium. And at that new general equilibrium, we're going to see that the economy has reached a higher level of output, right? We've gone from Y star to Y double star in the graph, right? And then we're also going to experience some inflation. We're going to go from that P star to that P double star. And that should make sense because if there's more people trying to demand and spend money on goods and services, that suggests there's going to be competition and it's going to bid up prices of goods and services. All right? So this model allows us to make quick, easy predictions about what will happen in response to some change. Now, the only other thing we've got to note about this model is that we can, even though it's not explicitly shown in the model, it's not tracked with a curve on one of the axes, is we can identify or predict what's going to happen to our third major variable because we're tracking output, we're tracking price level, but the question is what's going to happen to unemployment? Well, in this scenario, if we see an increase in household wealth that increases consumption, leads to an increase in demand, that causes some inflation, which we're not so happy about, but at least it grows the economy. And we know from our discussion of GDP and growth, the business cycle, that when GDP rises, unemployment should fall. Specifically, the cyclical part of the unemployment should fall. We may still have some frictional and structural unemployment, but at the very least, cyclical unemployment falls, so the overall rate of unemployment goes down. Now, in each of the other graphs, we've got different scenarios. So, for example, in the top right graph, we've got a decrease in demand. So this may be due to maybe we increase taxes on households, or maybe household debt increases, or maybe interest rates rise. And recall that an increase in interest rates would lead to a decrease in investment spending by firms. Right? It becomes more expensive for them to borrow. They borrow less, they spend less. That results in a decrease in investment, a decrease in demand. Maybe government cuts its spending, or maybe something that happens that decreases our exports. Our net exports goes down. And so in any one of those scenarios, we would get this decrease in aggregate demand. And as we see, the model predicts that a decrease in demand would lead to a lower level of output. So we'd experience some economic contraction. That would cause unemployment to go up, right? Because we're producing fewer goods and services. We need fewer resources like labor. And the model also predicts that this would lead to a decrease in the price level. In other words, we would predict some deflation. Okay. Now on the supply side, we can do the same thing. We can ask what would happen if resource prices changed or technology changed, and depending on what we observe, right, we show supply increasing or decreasing, and in either of these two scenarios, we would predict a different outcome for the economy. So if resource prices went down or technology improved, this would cause aggregate supply to increase, and as our model shows, this would lead to higher output, which would cause unemployment to fall, right? So that's good news. But also, higher supply would lead to lower prices. So this is kind of like a double thumbs up, right? We get growth, we get lower unemployment, but we also get downward pressure on prices. So that's kind of like the best possible scenario. The alternative, a decrease in supply, is kind of like the worst possible scenario. Because in this scenario, if we see resource prices go up or we increase taxes and regulations on firms, that decrease in aggregate supply is actually going to lead to a decrease in output. So again, we get economic contraction, which again causes unemployment to rise. But now, on top of that recession, or that contraction, on top of the rising unemployment, we've got inflation, right? So this is like a double whammy. This is double thumbs down. This is the worst possible scenario, okay? So ceteris paribus, if nothing else happens, and we have what we call a negative supply shock, we get higher unemployment, higher prices, and economic contraction, okay? We have a special term for this outcome. This is what we refer to as stagflation. And so this is a portmanteau word, where we take two words and we combine them. So we say that because the economy is contracting and unemployment is rising, we say that economic activity is kind of drying up, it's slowing down. We say that the economy is experiencing stagnation, right? So it's kind of like a puddle of water or a body of water that's it's not moving, right? And it starts to grow and get nastier. There's no water flowing in or out. So we say the economy is stagnating. And then on top of that, we've got inflation. We've got an increase in the price level. So we take those two words, stagnation, inflation, we combine them, and we describe this as a period of stagnation. Now, a few other things to note about some predictions in this model. We note that in two of these scenarios, we actually get inflation, so either an increase in demand or a decrease in supply. And depending on which of these two changes is actually happening, we may refer to this inflation differently. So if it's inflation due to an increase in demand, we refer to that as demand pull inflation. And then if we see prices going up, not because the demand side changed, but because supply side changed, so if we see prices rising because aggregate supply falls, we typically say that that's cost push inflation. So something must have caused firms' costs to go up, it decreases supply, and that causes the overall price level to go up. Okay, so we've got inflation, occurring on both sides of the economy, depending on what's happening. Now, the final thing to note, and this is the final question in the study guide, is what is the ratchet effect? Okay, now what we've got to ask is, when we're looking at our model, right, we're making certain predictions, and then we want to see, how good of a job does this model do at making predictions, right? Do these predictions actually happen in reality? And for the most part, this model does a really good job, with one exception. So we note that in two of these four scenarios, we get inflation. Okay? Well, if you look at the history of the U.S. economy, you see that on average, we're usually experiencing some economic growth, right? So there's more years of growth than there are of recession, contraction. Okay, but we do see that there are some periods in our history where we did experience an economic contraction, and typically it's due to a decrease in aggregate demand. So if you look back at the model, if we see what the model predicts given a decrease in demand, we see that we get lower output, so we'd have a contraction, recession, rising unemployment, but this model also predicts that prices would fall. Okay? Now this is a puzzle because our model says that a decrease in demand leads to lower prices, but when we look at actual data for prices, especially during times of recession due to a decrease in demand, what we see is that prices are still going up. At the very least, they're not going back down. And so we refer to this as the ratchet effect. And it gets its name from a ratchet wrench. And for those of you that know tools, right, a regular old hex wrench, you put the wrench on the bolt and you turn it either way, and the bolt moves in both directions. Well, a ratchet wrench, you attach it to the bolt, you turn the handle in one way and it tightens, and then when you pull the handle back the opposite direction, the bolt doesn't move, it just stays in place, and then the handle just swings back. Right? And so we see the same thing happening with the price level. We see that when we've got periods of higher demand or lower supply, prices get ratcheted up. Right? We get inflation. But then when our model predicts deflation, when our model predicts that prices should be ratcheted back down, or at least be brought back down, they don't. They don't fall. Right? They rise and then they get stuck. And then there's two reasons for this. When the price level goes up, households lose purchasing power. And so they're going to go to work and say, hey boss, I need a cost of living adjustment, right? I need you to raise my wages. Okay? Well, the boss pays higher wages, that raises the cost for the boss, that translates into even higher prices. Okay? Well, what about when households see prices going down, right? Well, if you're earning the same paycheck and prices go down, well, suddenly you have more purchasing power. Are you going to go to your boss and say, hey boss, I need an anti-COLA, right? I need you to lower my wages because I have too much purchasing power? No, it would not be in your rational self-interest to do that, right? You like having more purchasing power, and so you're going to ask that your wages go up when prices go up, but then you're not going to ask for a pay cut when the price level goes down, right? Similarly, firms, when they raise their prices, usually they may be raising their prices just to cover their costs, to break even. Well, what if the costs that firms incur to produce their products go down, right? What if resource prices go down? Well, let's say that you were just breaking even and then your costs went up and so you raise your price. What if your costs go back down? Well, if you leave your price, you're going to be experiencing some profits, right? And if you can do something to even lower your costs even further, then your profits are just going to increase. So what we see is that firms are more than happy to raise their prices to cover their costs, right? So they'll at least not lose money. They'll break even. But then if their costs go down, they're not so eager to translate those savings onto consumers. So both households and firms, right, acting in the rational self-interest, are naturally going to make choices that cause upward pressure on prices, but then they're not going to willingly accept the opposite, to lower their prices or lower their wages. And so for those reasons combined, we get this ratchet effect, the tendency for prices to rise but not fall. And so that's all we want to say about this model for now. All right, so we want to be comfortable, which is the basic model. All right, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and then just like we did at the micro level, we just want to be able to know, well, in response to some change, is this going to affect the demand or the supply side of the economy? Is it going to increase or decrease the supply curve or the demand curve? And then finally, what does the model predict with respect to our three variables: output, unemployment, and prices? And so we're going to use this model to analyze just natural changes in the economy, but then we're also going to be using this model for future lessons when we get into discussions about fiscal policy and monetary policy. We're going to see what this model predicts will be the result of changes in government policy.